Understood. Here is the text exactly as provided. Britain will build new attack submarines, invest billions on nuclear warheads, and move toward warfighting readiness. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Monday, shortly before the publication of a landmark review of the future of the country's military. Starmer's government said it would build up to 12 new attack submarines as part of its AUKUS partnership with the United States and Australia, replacing the country's current class of 7 subs from the late 2030s. And he will launch a historic renewal of the UK's nuclear deterrent, backed by a £15 billion, $20.3 billion investment, Starmer said in a speech in Scotland on Monday. The announcements came on the same day as the publication of the long-awaited UK Strategic Defence Review into Britain's armed services, which outlined how the British military would pursue an immediate shift toward greater use of autonomy and AI in the wake of Ukraine's experiences in its war with Russia. When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready, and frankly, to show them that we're ready to deliver peace through strength, Starmer said Monday. But Starmer refused to set out the timeline for his pledge that Britain's overall defence spending would hit 3% of the UK's gross domestic product, GDP. The uplift, announced earlier this year, is set to be reached by the end of the next parliament in 2034, but is dependent on economic conditions. And the Prime Minister did not set out where the money to pay for the new weaponry will come from. He previously announced cuts to the UK's aid budget to fund the uplift in defence spending, and he declined to rule out similar moves on Monday. According to the 144-page review, units in future will be made up of only 20% crewed vehicles, with the remainder of capabilities split between reusable platforms, like drones that survive repeated missions, and 40% single-use weapons, like rockets or attack drones. The Royal Navy is to move toward a more powerful but cheaper and simpler fleet, and the UK's 2 aircraft carriers, the largest in Europe, will shift to being used as a base for European rather than only British aircraft and drones. Meanwhile, under the waves, unmanned subs and sensors will police the North Atlantic against Russian military movements. However, some such capabilities will require a decade of investment and development, Dr. Marian Messmer, a senior research fellow at think tank Chatham House, told CNN. That stretches far beyond the forecast of certain European countries that Russia could be ready to threaten European borders militarily 6 months to a few years after ending fighting with Ukraine. Even so, the boosted investment in the UK's nuclear capabilities, as well as potential integration with European deterrence outlined in the document, will strike a nerve with Moscow, she said. The fiscal promise from the UK falls short of defense spending promises from some NATO countries, whose spending has been closely scrutinized by U.S. President Donald Trump. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte said last month he assumed NATO members will agree on a defense spending target of 5% at June's NATO summit, a significant increase from the 2% benchmark, which was agreed to in 2014. Per 2024 NATO data, only Poland's defense expenditure was above 4% of GDP, although Latvia and Estonia had promised increases to 5%, with Italy promising a hike to between 3.5% and 5% of GDP. The U.S.'s defense expenditure sat at 3.38% of GDP in 2024, making up some 64% of total NATO expenditure. Just weeks before NATO allies could agree on a significantly higher spending target, it seems a little risky for the UK government to essentially have boxed itself in to a 2.5% of GDP spending cap. Analyst Messmer told CNN, the UK's ambition to lead in NATO doesn't fit with spending in the middle of the pack among NATO allies, she said. Countering the Russia threat, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the subsequent pressure from Trump's administration on European nations to boost their own military capabilities, has sparked a race among Europe's key military powers to boost their readiness and counter the Russian threat should the White House pull its support for Kyiv. The UK cannot ignore the threat that Russia poses, Starmer told the BBC on Monday. Russia has shown in recent weeks that it's not serious about peace, and we have to be ready. Starmer said Monday he intended to turn the UK into a battle-ready, armor-clad nation with the strongest alliances and the most advanced capabilities, equipped for the decades to come. Government MP and member of the British Parliament's Defence Select Committee, Fred Thomas, told CNN that the review was a bold plan, and the first since the 1980s that argued for doing more, not less, with the UK's military. However, The British military of today is a long way from its Cold War ancestor. At under half the strength of the regular military in 1989, the British Army is a shadow of its former self. In 1989, defense spending accounted for 4.1% of GDP. If you want to prepare for tomorrow's war, you need to make sure you're at least ready for today's war. And we're not ready for today's war, MP Thomas said. Planners hope machines will make up for manpower. As part of the UK military, fundamentally transforming how it works, the review recommended enabling any sensor and weapon across the armed forces arsenal to work in tandem, using AI to predict threats and speed up decision-making. 10 times as lethal? Combining conventional armored forces with AI and land drone swarms, the review boasted of creating a military 10 times more lethal than the British military's currently is. Writing in the Financial Times, MP Thomas on May 31st, the lawmaker criticized the UK's Ministry of Defence's deep cultural and structural resistance to change, but he said he saw reason to hope in the recommendations laid out in today's review. At times frank, the review highlighted how a focus on exquisite capabilities has masked the hollowing out of the armed forces' warfighting capability. The document still offered a somewhat rosy vision of the British Armed Forces. This is at odds with much commentary in the British press, which has slammed the dwindling size, troubled and inefficient equipment procurement, and failures of conduct plaguing the British military through its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Analyst Messmer advised caution around some of the review's promises. 10 times more lethal is something that sounds good, but I would really want to see more evidence, she said. I think it's more marketing than anything else. Given decades of shrinking investment in the British military, questions have been raised over the deterrence that Britain's conventional and nuclear weapons offer, particularly given its reliance on a U.S. supply chain. In the past 8 years, the UK has publicly acknowledged 2 failed nuclear missile tests, one of them in the waters off Florida, when dummy missiles didn't fire as intended.